Homeric Greek is the form of the Greek language that was used by Homer in the Iliad and Odyssey, and in the Homeric hymns. It is a literary dialect of Archaic Greek consisting mainly of Ionic and Aeolic, with a few forms from Arcado-Cypriot and non-Greek languages, and a written form influenced by Attic. It later served as the basis of Epic Greek, the language of epic poetry, typically in dactylic hexameter, of poets such as Hesiod. Compositions in Epic Greek may date from as late as the 3rd century AD, though its decline was inevitable with the rise of Koine Greek. Main features. In the following description, only forms that differ from those of later Greek are discussed. Omitted forms can usually be predicted from patterns seen in Ionic Greek. Nouns first declension nominative singular, ends in eta, rather than long, even after rho, epsilon, and iota. Chi omega rho eta for chi omega rho alpha. However, theta epsilon alpha and some names end in long. Some masculine nouns end in short rather than eta sigma. Pi omicron tau alpha for Attic pi omicron tau eta sigma. The genitive singular of masculine nouns ends in alpha omicron or epsilon omega, rather than omicron upsilon. Tau rho epsilon iota delta alpha omicron for Attic tau rho epsilon iota delta omicron upsilon. The genitive plural usually ends in alpha omega nu or epsilon omega nu. Nu upsilon mu phi alpha omega nu for Attic nu upsilon mu phi nu. The dative plural almost always end in sigma iota or sigma. Pi upsilon lambda sigma iota nu for Attic pi upsilon lambda alpha iota sigma. Second declension genitive singular, ends in omicron iota omicron, as well as omicron upsilon. For example, pi epsilon delta iota omicron, as well as pi epsilon delta iota omicron. Genitive and dative dual, ends in omicron iota nu. Thus, pi omicron iota nu appears, rather than pi omicron iota nu. Dative plural, ends in omicron iota sigma iota and omicron iota sigma. For example, phi epsilon lambda omicron iota sigma iota, as well as phi epsilon lambda omicron iota sigma. Third declension accusative singular, ends in iota nu, as well as iota delta alpha. For example, gamma lambda alpha upsilon kappa pi iota nu, as well as gamma lambda alpha upsilon kappa omega pi iota delta alpha. Dative plural, ends in epsilon sigma iota and sigma iota. For example, pi omicron delta epsilon sigma iota or pi epsilon sigma iota. Homeric Greek lacks the quantitative metathesis present in later Greek. Homeric beta alpha sigma iota lambda omicron sigma instead of beta alpha sigma iota lambda epsilon omega sigma. Pi omicron lambda eta omicron sigma instead of pi omicron lambda epsilon omega sigma. Beta alpha sigma iota lambda alpha instead of beta alpha sigma iota lambda epsilon. Beta alpha sigma iota lambda alpha sigma instead of beta alpha sigma iota lambda epsilon sigma. Beta alpha sigma iota lambda eta omega nu instead of beta alpha sigma iota lambda epsilon omega nu. Homeric Greek sometimes uses different stems. Pi omicron lambda epsilon omega sigma instead of pi omicron lambda iota omicron sigma. Pronouns first person singular nominative singular. Gamma omega nu genitive singular. Mu epsilon omicron mu epsilon theta epsilon mu dative singular. Mu omicron iota accusative singular. Mu epsilon first person plural nominative plural. mu epsilon sigma, mu epsilon sigma genitive plural, mu epsilon iota omega nu dative plural, mu iota accusative plural, mu epsilon alpha sigma, mu epsilon first person dual nominative accusative dual, nu iota, nu omega genitive dative dual, nu iota, nu second person singular nominative singular, sigma epsilon, tau epsilon nu eta genitive singular, sigma epsilon omicron, sigma epsilon omicron, sigma epsilon, sigma epsilon theta epsilon nu, tau epsilon omicron dative singular, sigma omicron iota, tau omicron iota, tau epsilon iota nu accusative singular, sigma epsilon second person plural nominative plural, mu epsilon sigma, mu epsilon sigma genitive plural, mu epsilon omega nu, mu epsilon iota omega nu dative plural, mu iota nu accusative plural, mu epsilon alpha sigma, mu epsilon second person dual nominative accusative dual, sigma phi omega genitive dative dual, sigma phi iota nu, sigma phi nu third person singular masculine genitive singular, omicron, epsilon, theta epsilon nu dative singular, omicron accusative singular, epsilon, mu iota nu third person plural genitive plural, sigma phi epsilon iota omega nu, sigma phi epsilon omega nu dative plural, sigma phi iota, sigma iota accusative plural, sigma phi epsilon alpha sigma third person dual dative dual, sigma phi omega iota nu accusative dual, sigma phi omega epsilon third person plural pronoun or singular article rare nominative singular, tau omicron, third person plural pronoun or plural article rare nominative plural, omicron, alpha, tau omicron iota, tau alpha iota, dative plural, tau omicron sigma iota, tau sigma iota, tau alpha sigma, interrogative pronoun, singular and plural nominative singular, tau iota sigma, accusative singular, tau iota nu alpha, genitive singular, tau epsilon omicron, tau epsilon, dative singular, tau epsilon, genitive plural, tau epsilon omega nu. A note on nouns. Sigma and sigma alternate in Homeric Greek. This can be of metrical use. For example, tau omicron sigma and tau omicron sigma omicron sigma are equivalent. Mu epsilon sigma omicron sigma and mu epsilon sigma omicron sigma. Pi omicron sigma iota and pi omicron sigma iota. The ending phi iota can be used for the dative singular and plural of nouns and adjectives. For example, beta iota eta phi iota, delta alpha kappa rho epsilon omicron phi iota nu, and rho epsilon sigma phi iota nu. Verbs person endings nu appears rather than sigma alpha nu. For example, sigma tau alpha nu for sigma tau eta sigma alpha nu in the third person plural active. The third plural middle passive often ends in alpha tau alpha iota or alpha tau omicron. For example, alpha tau omicron is equivalent to nu tau omicron. Tenses future generally remains uncontracted. For example, rho epsilon omega appears instead of rho or tau epsilon lambda epsilon omega instead of tau epsilon lambda epsilon sigma omega. Present or imperfect. These tenses sometimes take iterative form with the letters sigma kappa penultimate with the ending. For example, phi epsilon gamma epsilon sigma kappa omicron nu. They kept on running away, aorist or imperfect. Both tenses can occasionally drop their augments. For example, beta alpha lambda omicron nu may appear instead of beta alpha lambda omicron nu, and mu beta alpha lambda epsilon may appear instead of nu epsilon beta alpha lambda epsilon. Subjunctive. The subjunctive appears with a short vowel. Thus, the form omicron mu epsilon nu, rather than omega mu epsilon nu. The second singular middle subjunctive ending appears as both eta alpha iota and epsilon alpha iota. The third singular or active subjunctive ends in sigma iota. Thus, we see the form phi omicron rho epsilon sigma iota, instead of phi omicron rho. Occasionally, the subjunctive is used in place of the future and in general remarks. Infinitive. The infinitive appears with the endings mu epsilon mu alpha iota, and nu alpha iota, in place of epsilon iota nu and nu alpha iota. For example, delta omicron mu epsilon mu alpha iota for delta omicron mu alpha iota, mu epsilon mu instead of epsilon mu alpha iota, mu epsilon mu epsilon mu, or mu epsilon mu alpha iota for epsilon mu alpha iota, and kappa omicron epsilon mu in place of kappa omicron epsilon iota nu. Contracted verbs. In contracted verbs, where Attic employs an omega, Homeric Greek will use omicron omega or omega in place of alpha omicron. For example, Attic rho nu tau epsilon sigma becomes rho omicron omega nu tau epsilon sigma. Similarly, in places where alpha epsilon contracts to alpha or alpha epsilon iota contracts to, Homeric Greek will show either alpha or alpha. Adverbs. Adverbial suffixes. Delta epsilon conveys a sense of to where, pi omicron lambda epsilon mu omicron nu delta epsilon to the war. Delta omicron nu conveys a sense of how, kappa lambda alpha gamma eta delta omicron nu, with cres theta epsilon nu conveys a sense of from where, psi omicron theta epsilon nu, from above. Theta iota conveys a sense of where, psi omicron theta iota, on high. Particles rho alpha, so, or, next, tau epsilon, and, emphatics delta eta, indeed, surely, pi epsilon rho, just, or, even, tau omicron iota, I tell you, other features in most circumstances. Homeric Greek did not have available a true definite article vocabulary. Homer uses about 9,000 words, of which 1,382 are proper names. Of the 7,618 remaining words, 2,307 are hapax legomena. Sample. The Iliad, lines 1-7. Mu nu iota nu epsilon iota delta epsilon theta epsilon alpha pi eta lambda eta iota alpha delta epsilon omega chi iota lambda omicron sigma omicron lambda omicron mu epsilon mu eta nu mu epsilon rho iota chi alpha iota omicron sigma lambda gamma epsilon theta eta kappa epsilon pi omicron lambda sigma delta phi theta iota mu omicron epsilon sigma psi epsilon chi sigma iota delta iota pi rho omicron iota alpha psi epsilon nu rho omega nu alpha tau omicron sigma delta lambda omega rho iota alpha tau epsilon chi epsilon kappa epsilon mu epsilon sigma iota nu omicron omega nu omicron sigma iota tau epsilon delta alpha delta iota sigma delta tau epsilon lambda epsilon iota epsilon tau omicron beta omicron epsilon lambda eta xi omicron delta tau pi rho tau alpha delta iota alpha sigma tau eta nu rho iota sigma alpha nu tau rho epsilon iota delta eta sigma tau epsilon nu alpha xi nu delta rho nu kappa alpha delta omicron sigma chi iota lambda epsilon sigma. Robert Fitzgerald. Anger be now your song, immortal one, Achilles or anger, doomed and ruinous. that caused the Achaeans' loss on bitter loss and crowded brave souls into the undergloom, leaving so many dead men, carrion for dogs and birds, and the wool of Zeus was done. Bibliography. Farr, Clyde. Homeric Greek, a book for beginners. University of Oklahoma Press, Norman, New Edition, 1959, Revised Edition. John Wright, 1985. ISBN 0-8061-1937-3. First edition of 1920 in public domain. Stamford, William Biddle, 1947. Introduction, Grammatical Introduction. Homer, Odyssey I-12-1. Macmillan Education Limited. pp. XLXXXVI. ISBN 1-85399-502-9.